Good afternoon, everyone. What type of race is life? When Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, was questioning Jesus, he was asking questions to try and get a sense of whether Jesus was guilty or innocent. Despite him coming to the view that Jesus was innocent in relation to the Roman law, he hands Jesus over to be crucified. And why? Because there was riots that were on the verge of happening. So he didn't want it would look good. Perhaps he would be thinking that it would look bad on his governance to have riots starting where he is presiding over. So a bystander looking at all this might think that Pontius Pilate wasn't governing the Roman law, he was governing the Jewish law, which was not his task or his responsibility. So, as Pilate would attest to, as we rise to different levels of responsibility, decision making can become more complex and multifactorial. Take, for example, a biscuit, right? Let's say a baby sees a biscuit on the ground. The baby might pick up the biscuit and eat it because the baby likes biscuits. But if a doctor was to see the biscuit on the ground, the doctor might think, okay, what's the fat content of the biscuit? What's the sugar content of the biscuit? How long has the biscuit been on the ground for? What did he say to his patient? He or she say to his patients that day, earlier that week, about eating things from the ground? How damp is the ground? There are numerous factors. What are his or her children watching? There are numerous factors that might come into play, and that's just a simple example. Pilate had numerous factors to consider, and politicians, even in, say, managing the coronavirus outbreaks, have numerous factors to consider in determining what the best decision is. So, as we rise to higher levels of responsibility, decision making can become more complex and multifactorial. So, returning to Pilate, Pilate's decision was to go down the path of least resistance. He decides to go down the path of least resistance. Least resistance in that context was handing Jesus over to be crucified, because it appeared that the opponents of Jesus were more threatening and more vocal than the supporters of Jesus. And so if Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified, the supporters of Jesus wouldn't really cause Pilate any harm, or the Roman governance any harm. And so he follows the path of least resistance. But so as we can see, following the path of least resistance isn't always the best decision. Right? Following the path of least resistance isn't always the best decision. From what I've heard, Pilate's life went downhill from that point on. And many of us might think that following the path of least resistance is actually the right course of action, because we might even think, Jesus was peaceful, Jesus wasn't confrontational, Jesus didn't offend people, and so it might actually be in our conscious or our subconscious thinking that we should not be, we should follow the path of least resistance. Yes, Jesus was loving, but Jesus did not live a life of least resistance. His truthfulness about his identity offended people. His statements to the leaders of his day offended people. His defense of his Father's house, where he turns the tables, offended people. Even his miracles offended people. When Jesus healed on a particular day of the week, many people were offended by that. In fact, in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 8, Jesus is referred to as a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. And so we see that Jesus doesn't follow the path of least resistance. That is, in fact, why he ends up accumulating so much anger from the Jews, because he was angering people in the way he was living his life. And so, is life then a sprint or is it a hurdles race? I'd say at this point, life is a hurdles race because there are obstacles that come in our path that we have to jump over. For Pilate, I would say it was more of a steeple because he had this massive obstacle that came in his path which he had to jump over, and he didn't. So effectively, he ran around the hurdle or ran around the steeple. And so, let us be mindful that as we walk in this world, things are going to come in our way. Peter, for example, he wasn't expecting perhaps to be questioned by people as to whether he knew Jesus when Jesus was brought in for trial. But Peter was questioned 3 times by 3 different people as to whether he was associated with Jesus or a friend or a follower of Jesus. And 3 times he ran around the hurdle. He followed the path of least resistance, and he effectively then kind of disqualified himself from the race. I mean, you can run around hurdles and perhaps you might run faster, but you'd be disqualified, right? So Peter failed, Pilate failed, but what about us? Paul was one of the great apostles who was Saul of Tarsus, then kind of had an amazing encounter with the Lord and became a wonderful follower of Jesus following. What type of race did he have? He had hurdles and steeples. In 2 Timothy chapter 4 verse 7 he says, I have finished the race. Now, is he referring to a race, that's a sprint without hurdles, or is he referring to a race with hurdles? Let's consider what he writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 24 to 27. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep, in journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleepless nights often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. So Paul's life had many hurdles and many steeples, and so I would say that our life should not be a sprint, it shouldn't even be a hurdles race. It should be a combination of the steeplechase and the hurdles. If you're familiar with the steeplechase, you've got these massive steeples, then you've got to jump into a puddle and then run out. The combination of that and the hurdles for the rest of the track. From an electrical circuit standpoint, talking about like circuits, electricity and all that, resistance is something that has saved many people's lives. Resistance is what stops or inhibits electricity from flowing from one place to another, and so many people have not been electrocuted as a result of resistance. The symbol for resistance is the symbol called ohm, and the measure of resistance is ohm, and the symbol for it is the last major Greek letter, which is omega. And Jesus is referred to as the Alpha and Omega, and as we understand, that is because he is the beginning and the end, and the first and the last. But Jesus was of infinite resistance because he resisted all of Satan's temptations, and he resisted all of the hurdles that were put in his path, all the way to the cross, and he jumped over them. And so Jesus is Omega in that sense as well. So friends, the walk that follows Christ is not a walk that follows electricity. It is not a walk that follows the path of least resistance. It is a path that jumps over the hurdles, meaning it confronts it, offends when necessary, when led to, and it follows the path of following Christ. And we need wisdom and courage to be able to follow that path of following Christ, wherever that leads and wherever that takes us. To God be the glory. Amen.